Quality Compass. Which way for micro-credentials? Welcome to this recording of the second edition of QAA's Quality Compass. The Quality Compass series aims to look more closely at emerging issues and help you navigate and respond to future challenges and potential opportunities. This issue focuses on micro-credentials, which form part of the discussions around modular qualifications and lifelong learning. As the Westminster Government announces more detail around its proposals for lifelong learning, and the Scottish Funding Council releases an additional 1.5 million upskilling funding for micro-credentials, we consider what this might mean for the sector and how we propose to push the agenda forward. We offer Quality Compass as a conversation starter, linked to our wider membership offer. We're keen to engage with you and provide the opportunity to share your thoughts and practices. If you would like to contribute to future editions or respond to anything we've covered in this version, please contact us at membership@qaa.ac.uk. Modular qualifications. What the policy papers say. As we noted in our members' project update on micro-credentials in December 2020, much has been made in recent months about the need for lifelong learning and the importance of technical education and skills development. Since then, the Westminster Government has published an interim response to the Auger report and a further education or FE white paper, Skills for Jobs, both of which have implications for the development of more flexible approaches to learning, and the Scottish Funding Council has announced additional university upskilling funding for micro-credentials in the 2020-21 academic year through the National Transition Training Fund. Going beyond the UK, international thinking on micro-credentials has continued to progress, most notably in Europe and Australia, with significant publications recently. First, in December 2020, the European Commission published its final report, A European Approach to Micro-Credentials. More recently, an integrative literature review of the implementation of micro-credentials in higher education, Implications for Practice in Australasia, has been published in the Journal of Teaching and Learning for Graduate Employability. Both of these address a range of issues relating to micro-credentials, including possible definition, relationships with established frameworks, role in employability and upskilling, quality assurance, and the subject of stackability and transferability between providers. The opportunities presented by small modular packages of learning have also featured in other events and articles in the UK higher education sector recently. These include our own Quality Insights Conference on the 23rd to 24th of February 2021, for which we had a strand specifically on connected curriculum, and at which the speakers included Emeritus Professor Beverly Oliver and Professor Sue Rees, two prominent international experts in this field. There's a sense of momentum gathering around the concept of short, industry-focused learning that enables upskilling, whether this is a form of continuing professional development within a career, to support somebody in reorientating their career, or to enable someone who does not yet have a higher education qualification to begin achieving credit at that level. Definitions and parameters. What's in a name? In various guises, micro-credentials can be said to have been around for a while, although that particular name is new. Higher education providers have a long history of running short courses, with or without credit, and aimed at various audiences from the non-expert, for example, summer schools often offered in the creative arts, to the highly specialist professional, for example, specialist schools development for teachers. Higher education providers have a long history of running short courses, with or without credit, and aimed at various audiences from the non-expert, for example, summer schools often offered in the creative arts, to the highly specialist professional, for example, specialist skills development for teachers, medical practitioners, or those working in digital media. More recently, a range of other related terms has entered usage. In setting out its scope, an integrative literature review for practice in Australasia notes, there is a spread of work on micro-credentials, digital badges, open badges, and some mention of alternative credentials such as nano-credentials. There's a risk that the proliferating terms create an unhelpful distraction, or worse, become impediments to practice. In the work that we've carried out to date exploring micro-credentials, we've indicated the following characteristics. They're credit-bearing against a recognised level of the Framework for Higher Education Qualifications, commonly referred to as the FHEQ, or the Framework for Qualifications of Higher Education Institutions in Scotland, abbreviated to the FQHEIS. They're subject to standard quality assurance mechanisms, and whilst there are no upper or lower limits on the amount of credit that a micro-credential carries, it should not normally constitute an award in its own right on the qualifications frameworks. This last point relates to an idea that a micro-credential does not necessarily mean a very small credit load, but rather that it's something being studied on a micro level. This means micro-credentials are not studied as part of a larger whole or degree, even if they are, for example, a module which might sit within an approved degree programme. Subdividing the definition of micro-credential further, with additional technical terms for the subcategories, introduces unnecessary complexity. It can imply a need for different approaches and management that need not and should not be there. We want to avoid a perceived need for additional rules and regulations. Those short courses that fit this definition of micro-credentials have been in operation for a long time. What we need to do is enable those further, not introduce constraints. For a first aside, micro-credentials or modular qualifications. Another term that's being used for this type of credit-bearing standalone learning is modular qualification. In some respects, modular qualification is a helpful alternative term, particularly around perceptions, because it can indicate that the short course is in its own right a qualification and does not need to be part of a larger whole to have credibility. There's a risk of confusion, however, as many higher education providers would describe their academic frameworks as modular. Thus, for now, we're continuing with the term micro-credentials, but our use of this includes developments and debate around modular qualifications. So challenges. What's stopping the rise of micro-credentials? In many respects, there's nothing impeding the development of micro-credentials as they're defined here, other than barriers associated with access to student funding and current approaches to reporting on progression and retention, which will be picked up a bit later. There are frameworks in place that support the development of units or modules of credit-bearing learning, and there is an agreed credit accumulation and transfer system, known by the shorthand of CATS. This also articulates with the European Credit Transfer System, or ECTS, through an agreed equivalence of learning hours. 2 CATS equals 1 ECTS, and understanding of level equivalence across qualification frameworks. Recognition of prior learning, or RPL, in admissions processes allows for a student to be given advanced standing on a programme for previously achieved credit or in recognition of experiential learning. Whilst there is not a requirement to construct a degree programme around credit, other than in Scotland, most UK higher education providers still choose to do so. The tensions, however, emerge in other ways. First, higher education providers tend to think in terms of whole programmes. There has always been an emphasis on the coherence of award. A taught degree would be expected to have clear aims and intended learning outcomes, and these could be tracked through all levels of the programme, with students following a linear route. Transfers do happen, particularly if a student's personal circumstances affect where or how she or he is studying, but there is no national curriculum in higher education. As a consequence, a student transferring into a programme at another provider may have particular knowledge or skills gaps that risk disadvantaging him or her, and there may not be the means or the will in the receiving provider to address this while still supporting advanced standing. Linked to this is a sense of shelf life of academic credit. Typically, academic credit is recognised for about 5 years in terms of its currency for returning to study. There can be good reason for this. Some fields evolve very quickly, particularly those linked to technology. If a student has had too long a gap between periods of engagement in higher education, he or she may have critical knowledge or skills gaps, which will impact on his or her ability to succeed. However, shelf life might need to be rethought for industry-focused micro-credentials. In the case of upskilling or continuing professional development, any gap in academic engagement is likely to be mitigated by an individual's ongoing engagement with that discipline through his or her employment. Where currency of relevant knowledge and skills is supported by industry, there is no disadvantage associated with shelf life. There might need to be an element of buyer beware for somebody stepping in and out of engagement with higher education, but in many respects, that's no different to anybody entering a programme of study or electing to take a particular module once enrolled with a provider. For instances where an individual is looking to reskill to enable a change of career, as opposed to upskill within a field, clearly articulated expectations of prerequisite knowledge and skills will be important, as will information on the content, aims, learning outcomes, and assessment for the module. But doesn't this sound familiar? These are reasonable expectations for any offering and no different to any other provision. They're not additional. So a short aside on credit frameworks. All 3 credit frameworks in the UK are able to support micro-credentials and the recognition of prior learning. The Scottish Credit and Qualifications Framework of 2015 has the support of lifelong learning as one of its explicit aims. One of its principles, Principle 20, states that it should facilitate and promote credit recognition for prior informal and non-formal learning and credit transfer. The Scottish sector also has a formal national recognition of prior learning framework. The Credit and Qualifications Framework for Wales 2019 includes sections on the recognition of prior learning and also addresses unitised accredited learning and vendor industry or professional learning as part of its lifelong learning pillar. The Higher Education Credit Framework for England is in the process of being revised at the moment. A draft was shared with the sector for consultation in December 2020, and a final version, revised in light of responses to that consultation, will be published in May 2021. This new edition includes a section on micro-credentials, as well as consideration of short courses and executive education. Credible credentials. Credibility is another challenge that arises from these short modules, even if they bear credit awarded by a university. They are a different experience for the learner. There has been a lot of media coverage this last academic year around the impact of COVID-19 on the student experience. Some of the conclusions have been that the pivot to blended and mostly online learning has been an enormous challenge and change for staff, but has been less of an issue for students. Instead, what has affected students the most is the loss of access to facilities and that wider traditional student experience. This varies with the type of provider, for example, campus-based or integrated within a town or city. Student characteristics, for example, undergraduate, postgraduate, resident or commuting, full-time or part-time, and also academic discipline, for example, humanities, creative arts, lab-based science, subjects allied to medicine or education. There is also a widely held view that there is added value from having a relatively uninterrupted, linear and immersive experience of higher education, aside from the degree itself. A higher education experience comprising small units of learning, gained over an elongated period, perhaps from more than one provider and punctuated by time spent outside of study, is very different from the traditional residential experience. To have credibility amongst students and employers, it will require different communication, engagement, and support. The only way is up, or stackability. A successful higher education experience traditionally leads to a degree. Many employment opportunities will stipulate applicants should hold a degree or have achieved a particular level of qualification. Evidencing that achievement remains difficult for someone who may amass a collection of micro-credentials which are not formally recognised as a qualification or group award. Micro-credentials also have a role in lifelong learning, and some might argue that an end qualification could interrupt that role. On those grounds, there is value in allowing an individual to amass micro-credentials throughout a career and record them just as he or she would an employment history. If we want micro-credentials to be as enabling as possible, the issue of stackability comes into play, where we should consider how an end qualification might be achieved by the accumulation of multiple micro-credentials over time. Whether a learner wishes only to study for 1 or 2 micro-credentials, amass a collection of them, or build them into a more substantive single entity or group award, the achievement of each one needs formal confirmation through appropriate accreditation documentation. This is not bureaucratic in the derogatory sense of the word. It is simply what a learner might reasonably expect in order to produce evidence of successful completion. The European Commission project has developed a proposed EU standard of constitutive elements of micro-credentials. Whilst providers in the UK might not wish to follow this model precisely, there is key information which could be provided and might include, for example, learner name or identification, title of the micro-credential, the awarding body, date of issue, workload in CATS NECS, level of study, mode of learning, aims and learning outcomes, the mark or grade achieved, common aggregation hierarchy and higher education classification of subjects code, so the HECOS code, and any professional, statutory and regulatory body or PSRB recognition. This is information regarding an approved credit-bearing programme of study that a provider might reasonably be expected to hold in its management information system already. Providing a learner with these details and confirmation of their success on a micro-credential does not seem unduly onerous, particularly as any student should be provided with a transcript of their period of study with a provider, irrespective of when they end their enrolment. New Zealand manages this through the requirement for all micro-credentials to be recorded with the New Zealand Qualifications Authority, NZQA. Providers are strongly encouraged to forward the names of all successful candidates of micro-credentials to the NZQA so that the achievement is recorded on the learner's New Zealand Record of Achievement, NZROA. The system of micro-credentials is more tightly regulated in New Zealand than the UK. It's not necessary to introduce such a system in order to enable stackability of micro-credentials, although visibility and credibility may be helped through some form of digital passport, as Sue Rees has suggested. The greatest impediment to stackability, even with a reasonable level of information evidencing the achievement of a micro-credential, is the sense of coherence of award. Higher education providers can already recognise micro-credentials that have been awarded by other providers through recognition of prior learning, but in making an award of an end qualification, they do need to have confidence in the overall coherence of that award. One way round this might be for providers to partner into consortia and explicitly recognise the micro-credentials of each other. In some respects, this is what underpins progression and articulation agreements that frequently exist between providers, and other models of such consortia have existed previously. Another option might be the opportunity to learn from practice in research degrees and take a more learner-led approach. PhD by publication is now widely accepted as a valid route towards attaining a doctoral qualification. There is no time limit or shelf life imposed on those publications, because the point is rather how the candidate presents them and draws out a narrative. While there might be a need for some providers to review their recognition of prior learning or RPL policies to enable something similar at the level of taught degrees, the possibility that a provider could develop a single capstone module, arguably at each level, that would enable a learner to make the case for the coherence of what they have achieved through micro-credentials, thereby achieving a great group award, is at least conceivable. This would be supported if, as suggested in the EU approach, a broad discipline indicator such as a CAH or arguably even a HECOS code were included on the confirmation of successful completion of a micro-credential. A distinct advantage is that this does not require the creation of new frameworks or types of qualification. It is possible that a new qualification could be introduced, which would specifically recognise the accumulation of micro-credentials. The potential benefits are that it could be less daunting to attain, with a lower credit requirement and fewer or no stipulations around minimum or maximum credit achieved at particular levels within higher education, and it need not require coherence around subject focus. Any developments in this direction would need to ensure that there was no compromise to the common understanding of academic standards, and that the new qualification was clearly distinct from the qualifications that already exist, including those that are more commonly exit qualifications, such as a certificate or diploma of higher education. At the same time, the relationship with current frameworks would need to be determined so that the ethos of lifelong learning was still enabled, and a learner could continue on their journey, building on their existing achievements without disadvantage. 5 potential models. In a report commissioned by QAA, Professor Sue Rees outlines 5 potential models for UK-based micro-credentials. These can be summarised as follows. Model A, independent. The learner builds skills and knowledge relevant to their individual or employer needs through a series of micro-credentials. Successful completion and/or assessment outcomes are categorised and recorded in a digital passport. Models B and C, entry and accreditation of prior learning. In these micro-credentials are used as entry to standard degree or postgraduate qualifications, either through the admissions process, whereby they are allocated tariff points, or credit exemption through a record of prior learning or accreditation. This system is already in use with the higher education sector, but can be an onerous and overly bureaucratic process for both the learner and the institution, with many stating it's easier to retake the credit within the degree programme. Model D, embedded or non-credit. Micro-credentials, including digital badges, are used to allow learners to acquire skills and competencies from a variety of global providers that scaffold a core of reflective, applied, practice-based capstone project or real-world learning, leading to a recognised university degree or postgraduate qualification. And then Model E, which is embedded stacking. Professor Rees explores all of these models further, including the benefits and challenges of each for learners, providers and employers. That report can be accessed on the QAA membership resources site. Returning to the policy landscape. In December 2020, the Westminster government announced more details around the Lifetime Skills Guarantee, with a list of courses which, from April 2021, will be free to adults of any age without a full qualification at Level 3 or equivalent. The white paper, Skills for Jobs, spoke further about the lifelong loan entitlement, noting that this was a key recommendation from the Auger report and would provide individuals with a loan entitlement to the equivalent of 4 years' worth of post-18 education to use over their lifetime. The white paper outlines this proposal as follows. The loan entitlement will be usable for modules at higher technical and degree levels, levels 4 to 6, regardless of whether they are provided in colleges or universities, as well as for full years of study. However, as the white paper also cautions, this will be a very significant change to the student finance system, and it has not yet been approved by the Treasury. Without this funding, there are some doubts about whether learners who have not yet had an opportunity to engage successfully in higher education and/or are from lower socioeconomic backgrounds will take up the offer of micro-credentials. Questions for providers. Irrespective of the size of a micro-credential, all learners have expectations about access to learning resources and support. There are questions providers will need to consider in relation to the full entitlement of students on micro-credentials. Are there sufficient library and learning resources to meet the needs of all students, particularly if there are large fluctuations in the number of learners? If these are learners who have been away from higher education for some time, they're likely to need additional support in academic skills and potentially specialist careers advice. There are also the pastoral support considerations, such as access to a counselling service. Furthermore, there are questions around engagement with the student representation system, including the Students' Union or equivalent. These are all critical factors for institutional planning. Another key concern for higher education providers will be the implications for student outcomes, particularly those around retention and employability, not least because student outcomes are currently taken as a proxy for quality and value. To take retention first, there are many reasons why learners may not complete a short credit-bearing course. As with any course, there is an onus on the provider to design a course and provide complementary support, which, together, gives students the best opportunity to succeed and achieve their potential. However, with a smaller investment of time and money, a learner may deliberately choose not to submit for assessment if she or he decides they do not want or need the confirmation of academic credit, or is satisfied simply to have had the learning experience on the course. Under current forms of reporting, this could have a significant detrimental impact on the provider's retention data. With respect to employability, if micro-credentials are intended to facilitate lifelong learning, how and when would we measure the impact on employability? Providers might want some reassurance in this area before they invest in an expansion of micro-credentials. Which way now? The interest in micro-credentials as a developing and potentially significantly expanding area of practice raises the question of what could and, more pertinently, should be done to support and enable developments. As Emeritus Professor Beverly Oliver concluded in her keynote address at the Quality Insights Conference on the 23rd of February, by the 2025, depending on how we proceed, micro-credentials will be seen as a fad that disappointed us or a key step towards reimagining lifelong learning for thriving and surviving. For micro-credentials to be a sustainable development and deliver lifelong learning as hoped, there will need to be a significant rethink of the experience of higher education and the value of a learner-directed, employability-focused approach. What are the implications for the learner of a sporadic engagement in higher education, studying for relatively small credit loads? Such learners may have an interest in higher education, but might primarily regard themselves as, for example, an employee. This has implications for higher education providers and other sector agencies, such as the National Union of Students. We will keep a watching brief on international developments. Whilst we'll not necessarily be driven by what's happening elsewhere, there is value in maintaining a global perspective, not least to avoid unnecessary barriers to mobility being introduced. More immediately, we don't see a need for a new framework aimed specifically at micro-credentials. We do see opportunities in exploring the possibilities of what can be achieved with the existing credit frameworks. Our forward plan of work includes offering advice, most likely in the form of a characteristic statement, which we'll develop in consultation with our members alongside a series of opportunities to share and shape practice. We have a number of projects underway which will inform our thinking, including, first, exploring the potential of micro-credentials and digital badging, a collaborative cluster project which is part of the current QAA Scotland enhancement theme Resilient Learning Communities. Led by Assistant Professor Anne Tierney of Heriot-Watt University, you can find out more about this project on the Enhancement Themes website. Second, modular learning by design, not default. This is a collaborative enhancement partnership project led by Bath College and involving partners including Bath Spa University, the University of Middlesex, Staffordshire University and Coventry University. The CEP projects are part of the QAA membership offer in England, aimed at supporting innovative practice. Through this range of work, we'll begin addressing key considerations around the challenges and the opportunities for micro-credentials. We hope that you've enjoyed listening to this edition of the Quality Compass. QAA offers Quality Compass as a conversation starter. Future issues will explore topics including curriculum design and approval, student engagement and success. We're keen to engage with you and provide opportunities for you to share your thoughts and practices. If you would like to contribute to future editions or respond to any issues we've covered in this one, please contact us at membership@qaa.ac.uk. Full details of the resources referred to in this edition of the Quality Compass can be found in the published document on the QAA website. If your provider is a QAA member, then do take a look at the wealth of resources available on the Membership Resources site, which is available to all students and staff of our member providers. If you're not yet a member, why not get in touch to find out more by emailing us at membership@qaa.ac.uk.